Hello and welcome to a quick guide on how to make effective class notes in literature. So first of all, before you can make any notes, you need to know what the purpose is of making those notes. So you really need to have in mind what it is that you're trying to achieve by writing anything down at all. So first of all, your class notes are a working record of the new information that you've received. And what I mean by a working record is that they shouldn't necessarily be immaculate. They should definitely be clear and something that you can refer back to and understand. They should be legible, definitely, and they should hopefully be set out in a way that makes sense. But that doesn't say that you can't cross things out, move things around, draw big arrows to show connections between things. They should absolutely show your thought process throughout that lesson. So rather than just a kind of word for word verbatim record, almost script, if you will, of what's happened in that lesson. It should be something that shows that you've engaged with it and you have transformed it and you've made sense of it on the page for yourself. Which makes my next point all the more important. You're thinking on the page and you're engaging with that lesson. So it might be that you write something down and then you draw a big question mark next to it because it's something that you need to remember to ask the teacher about or something that you want to look into further. It might be that you write something down and then you draw an arrow to something else on the page because you can see a connection between that. Or it might be that you write something down and you begin to see a connection that you want to colour code. So it might be important quotes on a certain theme, for example. A final reason that you would make class notes is to test that you've met the learning objective for that day. So even if your teacher hasn't expressed it at the beginning of the lesson, feel free to ask what that learning objective is, or maybe check it at the end. And it just means that if you have a clear agenda of what you're meant to get out of that hour, 50 minutes with your teacher, then you're going to make sure that you've understood what it is that you're meant to understand from that hour. So make sure that you have a clear goal in mind, is what I'm saying. This very busy image, I'm aware is a little bit overpowering, but I think is quite useful to think about how you structure your notes. So how you might use different symbols like dividers and bullets. So I suppose dotted bullets might mean something different to you in terms of compared to a checkpoint bullet that you can go back and tick off later on. Something that you put in a speech bubble might be a quote, for example, compared to a cloud might be a really key idea. So it's about how you use symbols and images to build up a kind of pattern that's meaningful for you. Things in terms of hierarchy here, so your headings might be all in capitals or might be a certain colour, and then your subheadings might be a different colour, or they might just have one underline and your headings might have two underlines, that kind of thing. So how are you going to kind of organise your information in a way that shows connections but also shows hierarchy and what's the most important? So what will you need to make good notes? Well, of course, at a very bare minimum, you will need something to write with, something to write on, and a copy of the text that you're studying. That is, the kind of bottom of the bottom expectations when it comes to literature students. We expect you to come with a pen, paper, and a copy of your text that you can annotate. What you should also come with is some pre-learning. So you should come with an idea of what is going to happen in that lesson, something that you've read around, hopefully. You might come, for example, with some context. If you're doing Othello, you might have done some pre-reading in terms of Shakespeare's biography, in terms of when the play was published and what the key issues were at that time in Jacobean England. You might also come with questions. So if you know you're doing a particular scene, you might have read that scene in advance, and there might be parts of it that you just didn't understand, or parts of it that you want to engage with further. So you might come with questions for your teacher and for your classmates. What's really, really good practice is to bring last lesson's notes, because often your notes will connect and you need that kind of reference point to refer back to. So rather than just making a set of notes and disregarding them and leaving them in the house or in your locker or in your bag, have them there in front of you to consult so you can start making those connections. The whole thing about learning is making connections in your memory, and it's much easier to have that in front of you to rehearse that information much more frequently than never looking at it again. You'll also need concentration and critical engagement for that hour in that classroom. So rather than just sitting back and, as I say, making a note of everything that your teacher says, everything that your classmates says, and just kind of, committing it all to the page as a kind of court record, you need to be asking questions and interrogating the information that you're confronted with. So things like, what does that mean? So if a new term is used, have you understood what that means? Or if you're confronted with a new idea or a new view of a character, for example, what does that mean in light of what I learned last lesson about that character? Or what does that mean for my understanding of this theme now? How does it link to what I already know is a really important question. So does it support a prior idea that you could link it with, or does it actually cause a big idea of debate and contrast and therefore push your ideas further? So showing contrasts and comparisons and similarities is going to be really important in your notes, and colour is a good way to do that. Which brings me on to the organising tools that you might also want to bring with you besides pen, paper and text. So you might want highlighters or coloured pens to show those kind of thematic connections. You might want to think about your headings and subheadings. Are you going to do certain ones in capitals and certain ones in lowercase? Are you going to do certain ones with double underline, wiggly line, no underline? Are you going to use a visual colour code or hierarchy so that you can understand carefully where the key bits of information are? Are you going to underline key bits, highlight key bits, put clouds or circles or boxes around key bits? So what is it that you should be noting down in class? Basically, things that you are likely to forget. And the things that you are likely to forget are things that you've not rehearsed well or thought about very often, because those pathways will not be made in your brain. So new information is really important. And by that, I mean things like terminology. So it might be the terminology of tragedy. It might be a certain dramatic device or literary device that you've not heard of before. It might be a definition of these new terms, but it might just be a key idea that you thought, oh, that was a really clever idea, I'm going to steal that. So your whole kind of note-taking process is magpieing phrases and ideas, clever, thrilling content from your teacher, from your classmates, and from your resources. So it might not necessarily be something that somebody has said, but something that you've read or a kind of critical interpretation. This is all feeding into your AO1, your big ideas, your arguments, but you're also making notes about methods and decisions that the writer has made and the effect of those decisions. You should definitely be making a note of any context. You might want a kind of context colour pen, if you will, so you can see it clearly on the page. So an understanding of where these decisions arose from and what they spoke to. And as I've said, critical interpretation, so quotes from what other writers have said, other readers have said. And finally, spellings. Your class notes should make a record of any new words and how to spell them accurately. Really important when it comes to your tragic terminology, because so much of it is Greek and quite tricky. So part of your note-taking process, a big part of it is organising it. And it's not just organising it on the page in terms of colours and in terms of your hierarchy of headings and underlining and boxes and symbols. It's also to do with what you're going to do with that group of notes from a term, for example, from a week. And I think what you need to think about to get organised is, how do you learn best? So are you somebody who really thinks in a kind of A to B in a sequential way, where you want to make, for example, if you're studying Othello, this is all my notes on Act 1, Scene 1, these are all my notes on Act 1, Scene 2. Are you somebody who actually thinks more thematically and wants to think about those connections across the text? So for all you're thinking about Act 1, Scene 1 today, you might be thinking about the theme of love and war, and you might also be thinking about the theme of the military and that kind of motif throughout Othello. You might also be thinking about the theme of self-doubt and how that corrupts Othello. You might be thinking in terms of character. So when I'm talking about themes, I don't just mean the kind of key ideas. I mean, are you going to track Desdemona in one colour and Iago in another? And again, that links to, are you a visual learner? So for me, I remember the colour box, for example, something was in and where it was on the page. So how something is laid out visually is very important to how I remember something. And that's why I draw big clouds and big boxes and use a lot of colour in my note-taking. So colour coding. If you were to do colour coding of Othello, this is what I recommend that my students track. And you can track that not just in your notes, but also in your annotated copy as well. So you might track key images. And even if you're studying a text that you're not very familiar with, or you're studying a text alone, the internet will tell you what the key images or what the key themes are going to be. So in Othello, you might want to look at service, the monstrous, poison, vision, plants, animals, and black versus white. You might do themes instead, because those images will feed into those themes. So you might do deception or appearance versus reality, love and war, justice, isolation, jealousy. Of course, the green-eyed monster would make me want to put everything to do with jealousy in green. If I was doing love and war, I'd probably do that in kind of pink or red, and that idea of connotations of romance. So really think through your colour coding in a way that makes sense. But you might also want to colour code your annotations, so your copy of the script or text, in terms of key methods that you know that writer uses a lot. So you might think about the use of contrast or dramatic irony. You might think about the use of repetition or alliteration or pathetic. So these are just some 3 final options and ways that you might organise your text. And you basically need to pick the one that's going to work the best for you. So option 1 would be the Cornell note-taking style. So you put your title at the top of the page, and then you divide your page kind of into 30, 70%. And you make your main notes in that 70% of the page, and you try and use abbreviations to make them as brief as possible. So you are just putting kind of bullet points, and you're not writing reams and reams. So it's really kind of already going through a process where you are selecting the key information. And then alongside that, on the left-hand margin in that kind of 30% of your page, you're reducing it to, it might be keywords, or if you're a visual person, it might be that you create a kind of image that sums that up. Key questions are really important here, so things that you want to follow up or things that you haven't understood that you need to look into. So you're really interrogating the information on the right-hand side in your left-hand column. Then you summarise at the bottom what your kind of key moments were from that lesson, what were your key takeaways, it might be how have you met the lesson objective. The reason this is so important is that not only are you filtering out and making decisions about what's important information and reducing and doing that kind of processing that already puts it into your brain, but this 30% of the page becomes a key revision tool where you come back to your notes later on, and from those keywords, if you cover up the notes, you test your memory and can you regurgitate that information just from the bare bones or just from those key images that you've put down. And you've also got kind of bouncing off points from your questions that you know that are your kind of next steps. So a really good memory aided note-taking style. Option 2 is basically how I regard my note-taking process in class. You're creating your own revision guide. So a good way of doing this is to think about, if you wanted a revision guide on that text, what would you want to cover? And for me, it would be plot, character summaries, and kind of, key quotes for characters, key ideas about characters, key quotes about characters from critics. I might want a whole section on tragedy where I put down all the tragic elements. So I put down things like victims, villains, downfall, and then I note everything from lessons that falls into those categories. As I've said, themes and imagery would be really important. So a good way to do this is to look at existing study guides, or to look at things like Cliff's Notes or Spark Notes, because they've already given you the kind of headings, if you will. So you might want biography in a whole collection of your folder. You might want critical essays. You might want character pairs. So this is an example from Othello. Major symbols and motifs. So you can look, if you're not sure about what you should be kind of organising your notes into existing study guides, particularly on the internet, which are so great at this, to be led. And this is a kind of filing system, if you will. And so I would have a whole notebook where I've given myself that title and lots of pages to record key images, or to record the plot, scene by scene, what happens. Option 3 is one that you're no doubt familiar with, but I just like this example from The Great Gatsby. It's mapping, and mapping is important if you are somebody who remembers things visually and where they are on the page, colour-wise, but also if you're interested in the relationship between things. So this is something that you could do for every single scene in Othello. So what's important about the setting of this scene? What's important about the themes in this scene? What do we learn about the characters? And you could have that map for every single scene or every single lesson and just add to it. And as I say, you could kind of maintain that kind of colour coding. So it's all about how you learn best and how you're going to remember best. Your notes are there for you to refer back to make sure that you've understood, but also for you to transform into something beautiful like this. So don't feel like they have to be gorgeous at first go. You're recording, you're engaging, you're challenging, and then you can go and transform it into something memorable.